Defying Dixie, The Radical Roots of Civil Rights, 1919 to 1950, tells the story of a group of civil rights movements that took place before what we have come to think of as the civil rights movement. When I first got to Yale from North Carolina, I would have a call about once a month from a Southern journalist who would have discovered, quote, the first Rosa Parks, would have found in the newspaper archives a black woman who refused to move to the back of the bus sometime in the early 50s, sometime in the 1940s, sometime in the 1930s. And I would tell the journalists that there were thousands of first Rosa Parks, that black women had been refusing to move to the back of the bus since there had been a designation for Jim Crow to move to the back of the bus, which of course would surprise the white journalist who thought that that had always been the order of things, didn't know that Jim Crow and segregation had been imposed at the turn of this 20th century. There were sit-ins. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. I was 11 years old when the first sit-ins took place at my favorite restaurant, Woolworth's, with the best grilled cheese in the world. But those weren't the first sit-ins. I tell the story in Defying Dixie of sit-ins that took place during World War II, led by a North Carolina woman, Polly Murray, in Washington, D.C. They were virtually blacked out in the white press. Of course, they were front page news in the black press. We think of Martin Luther King as the follower of Gandhi and one of the first people who realized the power of nonviolence and that kind of tool in thinking about the movement. But in 1932, James Weldon Johnson, who was the secretary of the NAACP, was reading his morning paper, a story about Gandhi, and he wrote in the margin, Gandhi and Du Bois compare. African Americans had been following nonviolent civil rights tactics from the time that Gandhi started using nonviolent civil rights tactics. Here we're taught as school children that Brown desegregated the schools, that Brown was the case of school desegregation in 1954. And of course, the first challenge to school segregation was in 1933 in North Carolina when a guy named Tommy Hocutt decided he wanted to be a pharmacist, and you couldn't be a pharmacist. You couldn't get pharmacy training in the black universities in North Carolina. So he went and applied with his attorney and with the black newspaper editor at the University of North Carolina in 1933. All of that is to say that we talk about the civil rights movement as, quote, starting in the 1950s, or we talk about the civil rights movement. But in fact, that was not the case. African Americans fought for civil rights and against the Southern system of white supremacy and racial oppression that went by the shorthand name Jim Crow from the very moment that Jim Crow was instituted, which was from the first moments after emancipation, beginning legally in the 1890s. So this is a much longer fight than the fight that we've called the civil rights movement. One of my favorite quotes is Duke University assembled a team of avid young researchers to go and interview elderly African Americans who might have remembered, like me, segregation, an elderly white person. And they sent them out throughout the South to talk about what life was like under Jim Crow. And the first question on the interview is, when did the civil rights movement come to your town? When did you join the civil rights movement? And this elderly man in Louisiana looked at the interviewer and said, I've been in the civil rights movement all my life. It didn't come to my town. It was, people were ready from within. So I want to just sort of outline for you what we get, how things look different when we add back 3 decades of struggle for civil rights before what became the civil rights movement. We might wonder why we have been taught that the civil rights movement started in the 1950s. One of the reasons we have been taught that is because It's the first time that the news blackout on black activism was lifted, and that was because of television. The actual photographs were coming from Montgomery, and white people said, well, gosh, there seems to be some kind of civil rights movement here. So historians have dated the civil rights movement from the first time that white people saw it in their living rooms in the mid-1950s. We also think that the civil rights movement was led by middle-class black men wearing ties who came from churches and religious backgrounds. And yet Martin Luther King was a master of political theater. As you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about what was in Atlanta and how he knew about the earlier decades of civil rights struggles, and he built on them, but he chose to present himself in a Cold War setting in the 1950s and in a very patriarchal moment in American society. He chose to present the civil rights movement as male, middle class, absolutely religiously based. That is not to say that it wasn't. That is to say that that was a part of it, but not all of it. If we look at the civil rights movement in the 1950s, we miss seeing any kind of radical impetus, any kind of radical activism that contributed to it, because we place it so squarely within certain class and in religious lines. We also get the impression that what black people wanted was a grilled cheese sandwich and for their little children to go to elementary school, completely removing any economic items off the civil rights agenda, where they had been foremost in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Equal opportunity was a kind of definition of equity, which included full civil rights and employment in residential desegregation, and in a kind of social equality that absolutely was not on the table in the 1950s. We also, when we look at the civil rights movement in the 1950s and think that that was the origins of civil rights, it sweeps away a long history of connections among civil liberties, union rights, labor rights, and civil rights. I'll talk a little bit about that, how people in Atlanta, white people, middle-class white people in Decatur, actually, came to believe that their own civil liberties were being circumscribed because black people didn't have civil rights, not in the 1950s, but in the 1930s. When we look at the 1950s civil rights movement as the fount of civil rights activism, it sweeps away a very vibrant popular front that was in the South in the 1930s that included communist. Atlanta was honestly a hotbed of communism. That included Methodist church ladies, that included socialists, and that included black activists. It also looks as if in the late 1960s, when the civil rights movement turned back to issues of poverty, issues of economic equity, people said, well, gosh, we don't know what Martin Luther King is doing. He's sort of gone off the track here by bringing this stuff and putting it into the civil rights movement. Or when the civil rights movement turned toward black power and black community building, people said, well, no, that's not what we bargained for. But in fact, those things were always on the agenda of a broader civil rights movement that took place before the 1950s. So I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that there was a hidden victory here. The name of the book is Defying Dixie. It's not Defeating Dixie. But what we do see is a much longer struggle with much more radical roots and many different goals that were never achieved by this movement that we know as the civil rights movement. Fortunately for me, resistance to white supremacy in the period from 1919 to 1950 divided very neatly into 3 decades. The first decade, the 1920s, was a period of incursions when Jim Crow was just being established in the South. The 1930s I call a period of resistance, where people from within and from without the South are trying to, to shake the foundations of white supremacy and are building a kind of anti-fascist rhetoric. And in the period of the 1940s, I call rebellion, which it was open rebellion. There was a complete and open civil rights movement in cities of the South all through the 1940s that was virtually blacked out in the white Southern press. So let me start just talking briefly about each of these decades and then stop in Atlanta in the 1930s and talk about what it was like here in the 1930s and how white Southerners used the Nazi example, how black Southerners used the Nazi example to fight white supremacy in Atlanta. But first, the 1920s. If we talk about the South as a place that was not radical, we have to count out thousands of Southerners who were radical, who were forced out of the South in the Great Migration in the 19-teens. Black Southerners, 80% of African Americans in the country lived in the South in 1920. And those people were pushed out of their homes, often by violence, throughout the period of the teens and 20s and into the 30s. Those are people that I continue to count as Southerners. They're expatriates, but they're Southerners. To these people, region was a state of mind. It wasn't where you lived. And they went across the Mason-Dixon line, firing back, trying to liberate their neighbors, trying to make the South a place they could come home to. One of the first people I talk about in the book is the first African-American communist, the first black communist born in the United States. He was born in Dallas, Texas. His name was Lovett Fort Whiteman. And he, in 1919, comes south to organize, but is arrested by J. Edgar Hoover himself and thrown in jail, and becomes, actually after that, becomes the communist that J. Edgar Hoover feared that he was. He goes to Moscow. He begins to dress like a Cossack. He wears long sash shirts, and they're called rabotchkas. And he's stunned that in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, racism is illegal. It's called social poison. It's outlawed. So he decides that communism is the way to stop white supremacy, and founds an organization to do so. So he's the first black Marxist. The communists come into the South in Gastonia in 1929. They come into Atlanta in 1931 with a group of organizers, black and white. Meantime, white Southerners, Woodrow Wilson is a white Southerner, are trying to export white supremacy. Jim Crow had wings. The Klan organizes worldwide. In, for example, Australia, a black jazz band is traveling around. They're called Sonny Clay and His Colored Idea, and they start dating white Australian women. And the leading Australian politician says, "We're not men here. If these guys were in the American South, they wouldn't live through the night." We're exporting this idea that the South can manage people of the darker races. They can teach empires how to maintain their colonies and how to maintain their subjects. So during the 1920s, these two ideas are vying against one another, really worldwide. What is going to happen? Will people of color forever be subordinated to white supremacy? Or, equally unlikely, will there be a Marxist revolution in Atlanta, Georgia? So I don't argue that the radicals caused the civil rights movement. I argue that there was a spectrum of activism, and it took a radical end to that spectrum. It took the fact that some people were radical enough, as communists were, as black communists were, to go into the South and say, when a white person asked them, "Would you want your daughter to marry a Negro?" White communist organizers would say, "I'd rather her marry a Negro than marry you." So they held up a vision of total equality that was unmatched and has always been unmatched in the South since. The 1930s are a different moment because the communists are in Atlanta organizing, and so are a group called the Black Shirts. I want to read just a little bit about the Black Shirts in Atlanta so you can get a sense for how close this action was to you. What happens is that Southerners and African Americans begin to hold up the example of fascism against the example of white supremacy. In the hot Georgia summer of 1939, an Atlanta men's clothing store advertised a remarkable piece of attire. Black shirts, American fascist, we have just what you want. Why not wear one to the meeting Monday night at Lakewood Heights? Several prior black shirt rallies had already whetted customer demand. The ad invited every, quote, white he-man in Atlanta to come and have some fun. We will carry forward the sublime principles of the black shirts, while the fascists left the definitions of he-man and fun to the reader's imagination. The sublime principles they spelled out quite clearly, quote, to inculcate and foster in the minds of our members and the public generally white supremacy. The group spread quickly to 4 other Georgia cities, and within a month they claimed 27,000 members in Georgia. Fascism festered in the second Ku Klux Klan's hometown of Atlanta as the black shirts linked race, economics, and politics in ways that would have made Mussolini proud. Before Christmas, there isn't going to be a black bellboy or truck driver in Atlanta. The problem, according to the black shirts, was that African Americans lived in southern cities at all. They belonged on farms. Quote, if white men would assert their rights, there would be no unemployment in Atlanta or other cities of the South. In good times, white workers could feel superior to black workers who worked in the most debased jobs, sharecropping, the lowest paid industrial jobs in segregated circumstances, or in domestic work. But in bad times, white people wanted those jobs. Quote, white men in the South today are driving trucks and wagons once driven by Negroes, repairing streets and delivering ice on their own backs. Black shirts offered these starving white workers a solution to the problem of the Great Depression, the extension of segregation. If all black people went back to the farms, white people could take up all the wage labor jobs. Do you realize that there's several thousand unemployed black men in Atlanta? They ask elite white men. In a quandary on how to replace your black servants, the black shirt newspaper ran classifieds of all the white people who would take their jobs. The black shirts were particularly angry at elite white Atlantans who wouldn't fire their maids, their caddies, their chauffeurs. Across the South, white men attacked black men at work. In Texas, an unemployed white man, quote, incensed because a Negro was working and he was not, shot and killed the Negro. In Florida, white men kidnapped and flogged 5 black bellboys until they said they wouldn't go back to work. In Atlanta, the black shirts threatened the Coca-Cola Company and Rich's department stores, first with a boycott and then with violence if they didn't fire all their black workers. But it didn't take long for the black shirts to feel the wrath of Atlanta's affluent white people. Alerted by their, quote, greatly disturbed cooks, nurses, and other domestic help, alarmed housewives called the police to complain about the black shirts. White businessmen and housewives panicked at the thought of their domestic workers, janitors, chauffeurs being shipped off to some remote tenant farm. Who would drive Miss Daisy? A leading white man mused that firing 1,000 experienced African Americans to replace them with 1,000 inexperienced white people would be downright ridiculous. And some white ministers said, quote, any man, black or white, is entitled to hold a job for which he is qualified and earn an honest living for his family. The mayor of Atlanta told all citizens to set your faces against every person seeking to embroil the races in trouble. In fact, the Fulton County grand jury met to see what to do about the black shirts. They first denied them a parade permit, as they had done the communists a week or so before, and then they asked the state to revoke their charter. The grand jury scolded the black shirts, quote, We insist that this particular kind of haberdashery be worn in the homeland of fascism and not in America, as our people could be at better business than aping the reactionary institutions of Europe. In other words, Southern white supremacy, Jim Crow, was a modern way to manage races. Fascism was a feudal way. The Atlanta Constitution told its readers, quote, "White supremacy means the legitimate rule by lawful means of the greatly major race, not some foreign, sinister, and dangerous propaganda." This kind of threat in the South caused African Americans and mostly their Jewish allies, both in the South and elsewhere, to begin to hold up a mirror to fascism and to argue that there weren't so many differences between what was happening as first in Italy and then in Germany in 1933 and what was happening in the American South. Now, everyone believes, historians have always argued, that Americans, quote unquote, didn't understand the fascist danger to the Jews. They didn't know what was happening. The leading book on American reaction to Hitler's campaign against the Jews in the 1930s is called Beyond Belief. But it was front page news on every African American newspaper, every single issue from Hitler's takeover until 1940. African Americans understood clearly what was going to happen to the Jews, and they predicted it in a million different ways. Whether or not they argued that the South was better than Germany or Germany was worse than the South depended on the time in the 1930s, around 1936. Before 1936, they argued that the South is worse than Germany. After 1936, they begin to realize that Hitler is bent on the extermination of the Jews, and they warn people about it. What this did, basically, was it alarmed a lot of Americans to the fact that perhaps white supremacy couldn't last. Perhaps white supremacy would be like Nazism. And in Atlanta, there was a lot of labor unrest, particularly in the cotton mills, as you probably know. In 1934, there was a general textile strike, and they began to round up textile workers, and they put them in a concentration camp in Fort McPherson. I don't know if you had heard about that. It was front page news in the New York Times. The battle about civil liberties began to cause white Southern liberals to realize that civil liberties and civil rights are the same thing. I want to read just a couple of paragraphs about some trials here in Atlanta and Decatur that came about this time that caused white Southerners to realize that perhaps even they too should recognize black civil rights. Governor Talmadge called out the National Guard in the 1934 strike, and the Guard intercepted people, took them to Fort McPherson, where they incarcerated 140 strikers. Women held in concentration camps, said the first front page of the New York Times, as it showed four stylishly dressed mill workers in front of an armed soldier. The same photograph ran in the Atlanta Journal under the caption, "Atlanta's own detention camp for pugnacious strikers is seen here in smooth operation today." Then the Atlanta Journal bested its hypocrisy of the previous day, adding 8 machine gun pits command all entrances to the camp. Heavy patrols guard all the borders. The Nazis had a field day with the Georgia news. Page-wide banner headlines ran in Berlin newspapers announced that concentration camps are being established in America for strikers and insurrectionists. Whites and Negroes are being confined in the same camps near Atlanta. The Atlanta prosecutor had zealously prosecuted communists in Atlanta, and he'd arrested a man named Angelo Herndon for handing out Marxist literature. I've just met some people who had commemorated Angelo Herndon's 75th anniversary of his arrest. He Angelo Herndon was handing out literature. He was arrested on charges of sedition, sentenced to death for handing out literature. White Atlantans began to think that perhaps they needed to protect their own civil rights. Even though Angelo Herndon was a black man, if you could be sentenced to death for handing out literature, history professors from Emory came to testify at the trial that the same books were in the Emory Library that he'd been handing out. So the prosecutor is named John Hudson. Atlanta prosecutor John Hudson capitalized on the upheaval of the strikes to step up his anti-communism. He raided the lawyer's office in Atlanta, where he met an angry man, a black lawyer named Ben Davis, who demanded a warrant. Then the Fulton County and DeKalb County police forces raided the Interracial Urban League, the Black YMCA, and even meetings in private homes. For example, this one in Decatur. A gathering at the home of a white female public school teacher netted copies of the New Republic, Red Book magazine, and her teenage daughter's copy of Are Petting Parties Dangerous? A Fulton County grand jury began an investigation into the Red Menace, but the neighboring DeKalb County grand jury dismissed the charges against all those rounded up there. An Emory University student who had been ensnared commented, "I used to think this was a free country, but I know better now." The authorities' draconian measures led white Atlantans to join with black Atlantans to set up a defense fund for Angelo Herndon. They were afraid to call in the National ACLU because they were afraid they'd be seen as northern agitators, so they started their own Atlanta CLU, their own ACLU. This group of people began to connect a kind of oppression with a kind of language of tolerance, a kind of language of human rights. They began to talk about Nazi discrimination as a cancer. And in 1939, the Atlanta Journal, which only 3 years before had not mentioned, had never run a picture of Jesse Owens, nor had mentioned him in a headline, and had commonly used the word darky in referring to African Americans in Georgia, ran an editorial that said, amazingly, "We must eradicate the cancer of racial intolerance in this country, or it will kill democracy." So within a decade, we had turned around racial discrimination from being intolerant, from being race pride, to being intolerance, to being a cancer on the face of democracy. The final third of my book is about the 1930s, when black Americans determined not to make the bargain they had made in World War I, which was to go fight first and get their rights later. They determined in World War II to fight on both fronts, double victory. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home. This is why we find sit-ins in the nation's capital, and the picketers are carrying signs that say things like, "Could Hitler eat here?" We find people refusing. It's basically a war over buses in the South because they're very overcrowded during the war, and the whole distinction, the whole choreography of segregation about where you're supposed to stand, what you're supposed to do, breaks down, and black people refuse to move to the back of the bus. In fact, they refuse to move to the back of the line, because if they move to the back of the line, they won't get on that bus or the next one or the next one. So there's outright rebellion in the South during World War II. They don't get in asking for victory against racism at home. It's not complete in World War II. They don't desegregate the armed services. We don't get any legislation about desegregation. We get something called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is theoretically going to desegregate the war industries. So everything is on the table when the war ends and the UN is founded. And the UN is the great hope of the people in my book. are all in San Francisco at the conference. They're filing petitions. And when we, as a country, sign the Human Rights Declaration of the UN Charter, they say we've outlawed racism. So why, with that incredible background, do we then find ourselves in the 50s putting all the weight of stopping, of reversing racism in this country on the backs of one Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, on the backs of school children? If the civil rights movements of the 20s, 30s, and 40s had found their way, there would have been a Brown for every single facet of inequality in this country. There would have been a court case like Brown for residential desegregation instead of incremental court cases that we had. There would have been a kind of earlier than the 1964 Civil Rights Act Supreme Court case in the 1940s that would have opened up jobs in this country. Unfortunately, by the time that we begin to get a civil rights movement, anything that's an economic issue is considered sort of pinko. It's sort of communist to talk about economic equity. So how does it look different if we look at these 3 decades? Well, we get a more international civil rights struggle. People who lived in Atlanta knew very well what was going on in Berlin. You would have thought Moscow in 1932, you would have thought it was Peachtree Street. There were Clark Foreman from Atlanta was there, Vann Woodward from Atlanta was there, John Hope, who was president of Atlanta University, was there, Ira DeReed was there. You couldn't stand at Red Square without meeting somebody from Atlanta. So we get, instead of this image of the South as always isolated, they didn't know any better, it was actually an incredibly international place. We also get a more radical South. We also get a tougher white supremacy. If you know that it took all of this against this wall of white supremacy, if white supremacy could reinvent itself so that we didn't desegregate my high school until the year I graduated in 1966, then white supremacy is a lot tougher than maybe Lovett Fort Whiteman thought it was when he thought he could get it outlawed in the 1920s. And you also realize that white Southerners could never have been surprised by integration or surprised by Brown versus Board of Education. They had been fighting similar things on every front for their lives and for their parents' lifetime. You also realize that the turn of the civil rights movement in the late 60s was not a betrayal of some civil rights agenda that was sacrosanct, but it was in fact part of a larger movement that had gone on for the entire century. I think that in Brown v. Board of Education we had the single most important decision, the single most important event of the 20th century. It changed everything. But I would argue it's not all we could have had, it's not all we deserved. And when we look around today and we wonder why things are the way they are, and we say, well, didn't we have a civil rights movement? I think that the thing that we can take away from realizing how much deeper, how much longer, how much more entrenched white supremacy was than we may have thought it was, is that we did have a civil rights movement. We had a very long one, and the part of it that we have come to call the civil rights movement only partially accomplished the agenda that we had before us. The rest of it remains to be done. So thank you very much for coming. I'd love to have some questions. I am a little bit hard of hearing, so can you really speak up?
I'll try to project.
You are.
Thank you. I really enjoyed reading your book. I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you.
And one of the main strengths of the book is the way you depict the main characters. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what tragically finally happened to Ford Whiteman, and also tell us a little bit about Pauline Murray, the wonderful woman you talked about, great like that.
He's a plant. No, he's not. I don't know him. Could you hear the question? Okay, Lovett Fort Whiteman, the first black American-born communist, is an old Bolshevik. He goes to live in Moscow in 1928, and he believes before Stalin has really has a grip on power, Lovett Fort Whiteman believes that he has a lot of input into Marxist policy. Indeed, he does. In the 1920s, people are on the ground working out whether they're going to go into the South, where they're going to go. As Stalin consolidates power, Lovett Fort Whiteman continues to be outspoken. And by 1933, 1934, he's in trouble. The Soviet Union tries to make a film called Black and White, trying to depict race relations in Birmingham, Alabama. 22 young African Americans go over to make the film. Everybody's gung-ho. Lovett writes the script, and the film, and Langston Hughes cleans it up. And the film is canceled because America tells Stalin that if he ever makes that film, they will never recognize the Soviet Union officially. They cancel the film. The United States recognizes the Soviet Union 18 months later. So Lovett is sort of out on a limb. He continues to talk about how important it is to organize around issues of race, but that becomes the wrong thing to say in Stalinist Russia. And he's first exiled to a place called Alma-Ata, which is actually a beautiful town, about 7 hours by train away from Moscow. Then Stalin issues quotas for each region to round up people who have been exiled or who seem to be suspect. And Lovett Fort Whiteman is in the quota for Alma-Ata, and he's sent to Kolyma, which is actually sort of not a place. It's sort of a traveling hell in Siberia, where they're building the Great Siberian Highway. It gets colder than the South Pole there. Lovett is still mouthy. They knock out all his teeth. They're starving him to death, and he dies. His death certificate says his heart stopped. So he dies in the Gulag. Another major character is Polly Murray, who is from Durham, North Carolina. She is sort of the Forrest Gump of civil rights. She's just great. She challenges UNC to get into graduate school in sociology. She refuses to move to the back of the bus in Petersburg, Virginia in 1940. She fights for sharecroppers' rights. She condemns the white jury system. She goes back to Howard Law School. She graduates as valedictorian. She leads the sit-ins in Washington. The valedictorian of Howard always gets to go to Harvard. It's 1944. But North Carolina had rejected her in 1939, saying members of your race are not admitted to the university. Harvard Law School writes her a letter and says members of your sex are not admitted to the Harvard Law School. So she begins to realize that she should maybe keep fighting Jim Crow, but start fighting Jane Crow. Ultimately, she does that. She works with a woman from Atlanta named Thelma Stevens to go through every single state and catalog all the segregation laws. She writes a 757-page book, and they send it out to all the Methodist church ladies, all the white Methodist church ladies, and say, challenge these laws in your community in 1948. Polly Murray, along the way, has decided, at first, she's attracted to women, and she's very religious, so she thinks that God must have made her a man. So in 1936, she says that she is a transgendered person and tries to have a sex change operation. The doctors in America will not do it. She's read that this has been done in Germany. But she comes to terms with this. She realizes that she's actually gay. She's a lesbian. And so that haunts her all her life, along with a brief moment of being in a communist offshoot called the Communist Party Opposition, which was a group of people who were anti-Stalinist during the Depression. So she's up for director, legal counsel of the EEOC. when it is founded. She's been a consultant to the EEOC. She's going to get the job. They send it to the White House, and LBJ's people say she was a communist, and she can't have it. She decides to go back. She's a founding member of the National Organization for Women. She's on the president's. She's on a subcommittee, not the main committee, but a subcommittee on the President's Commission on Women, and she goes back to seminary in the Episcopal Church, where she is finally, after a third try, they decide to ordain women. They ordain women. She is in the first group of ordained women, and she's the first black woman to become an Episcopal priest. That's her life. It ends much more happily than Lovett Fort Whiteman's. She says that every little battle that she fought was part of a struggle that actually paid off in the Civil Rights Movement. It's not separate from the Civil Rights Movement. It's not separate from what happened in the 1960s or 70s. Each little step mattered. Even though she never won one of her fights, she lost almost every battle. Yes? He's my second plant. Pauli Murray met Eleanor Roosevelt at a camp, kind of like the Civilian Conservation Corps for guys. They had CCC camps. Well, they also had she camps where they sent women out to the woods to fatten up during the Depression. Pauli was very poor throughout the Depression, and Eleanor Roosevelt came in, and Pauli Murray was reading Karl Marx and refused to stand up. Got kicked out of the camp, and so she began writing Eleanor Roosevelt. And when I first started the book, I thought she was important. Eleanor was important to Pauli Murray, but was Pauli Murray important to Eleanor? And she absolutely was. They wrote for 20 years, and often. And when Pauli Murray went to Los Angeles, and the white neighbors left a note on their door that black people couldn't live on that block. They had to move a block away. The first thing she did, she also the same day in the mail had a letter from Eleanor. And the first thing she did was write Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was interested in the civil rights struggle. She recognized what it was. She worked for sharecroppers' rights. She worked for mixed race juries. She worked to abolish the poll tax. There never was a moment that she didn't work against segregation. However, there's a wonderful letter in which Pauli Murray says, I'm just going to stand up and say segregation is wrong. It's not going to be any more about voting, or it's not going to be any more about the poll tax, not about these legal things. But in 1943, I'm going to stand up and say it's wrong. I'm going to have a sit-in. And Eleanor Roosevelt says, well, my position is different. I have to work structurally in government to make government grant civil rights. You have to take them. You have to go out there and take civil rights. So she understood exactly, Eleanor Roosevelt understood exactly where she stood and exactly where civil rights activists stood. Eleanor Roosevelt on civil rights was far more heroic than we've even begun to give her credit for. And a lot of people have already written about her being great, but it's a phenomenal record. Yes?
I know you discuss in your book the Commission on Interracial
Cooperation. Yeah.
As I recall, that was founded in Atlanta in 1919, I believe. What role did that play, and how radical was it? I don't think it was what we would call radical, but I want your take on it.
There's a really good book about there are a couple of really good books about it, but there's one about how it came to be founded here, and it was because of the Atlanta racial massacre. It was that after the massacre, Governor Northern and a bunch of other people decided that law and order was bad for business in Atlanta. And so they started these groups of churchmen. The papers are over at the Atlanta History Center. And they start all meeting and talking about how they can make segregation work better. And John Egan, who was a civic leader here, was fundamental in this movement. So by 1919, after World War I, black people come home, black servicemen come home in uniform, and they're shot and lynched in uniform. They're pulled off streetcars. They're beaten to a pulp for wearing the uniform that they fought for. And so people in Atlanta decide they must form something to stop the violence. And they form commissions on interracial cooperation. There's a statewide such organization in every southern state, and then there are local commissions. And these are, quote, the best people, the middle-class people, black educators, white civic people, a lot of Methodist and Baptist church people, black ministers, and they sit down and they try to talk about how to prevent violence, how to provide more money for black education. It's all about ameliorating white supremacy. A group of them in a wonderful book by Jacqueline Hall called Revolt Against Chivalry, women join them and start trying to prevent lynchings by going out when they hear there's going to be a lynching and trying to stop it and investigating what happened. What I argue, I mean, these are noble people. These people are better than all of my ancestors. They're really good people. And in 1919, they're radical. But by 1938, many of them are still, 20 years later, are still involved, and they're not accepting the idea, even in the face of fascism, that segregation is someday going to have to die. A lot of them, Clark Foreman decides he's one of the leaders of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation. He's in Atlanta. He decides that segregation is going to have to end, and he goes and works for the New Deal. Will Alexander, who's head of it here after him and head of the state, the Southern Wildwood, goes to the New Deal and starts working in the Department of Agriculture with a black economist named Robert Weaver, and they become best friends. Will Alexander says, I've never loved anyone like I loved Robert Weaver. And Will Alexander decides segregation has to go. So there are all these people individually white people deciding segregation has to go, but they can't say so because the Commission on Interracial Cooperation would collapse, because there are people in that who think segregation should stay and then we'll all rise on either side of the fence. So one thing that I do is I argue that after about 1937, this very liberal strategy has become a very illiberal strategy. It's become a way to put off till tomorrow what we should be doing today in the face of fascism. And a lot of white people are breaking with it. In fact, it is a moment. It's black people, not all of them who are involved with it, start saying we're going to support. They don't call it integration, but they call it desegregation. And so it sort of collapses into the Southern Regional Council in the 1940s, which becomes a different kind of sociological way to promote better relations and better class relations. You know, I think that what we've tended to do in the South is not chronologize white supremacy enough. And so when you certainly, I would never argue that the Commission on Interracial Cooperation was a bad bunch, but they're not on the cutting edge in 1938 like they were in 1928, and certainly not like they were in 1919. Yes?
Context, what's your impression, your full perspective on this, of how a single decision might have made a dramatic difference? And I think, for example, of Truman's integration of the armed forces.
He asked how a single decision might have made a huge difference. I'll tell you the single decision that could have made the biggest difference, and that was the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which left all of these white Southerners who had been liberals and working with some radical communists for civil rights in the South in the late 1930s. It left those people out on a limb. Yes, it was horrible. I mean, suddenly, you know, there was no Popular Front there, and the Southern Popular Front had been about civil rights. So other single decisions. I think I'm a big NAACP supporter, and I've said this to the chairman of the board of the NAACP, but I think that if the NAACP had moved a little more quickly in the 1930s on the desegregation cases, when we had this anti-fascist surround, that we could have actually desegregated some universities. The cases were there, but they were worried about making bad law, and so they were going to the upper South states, border states, taking graduate students where you could prove that, of course, it wasn't equal. They weren't arguing about separate. They were saying, well, it's not equal if you don't have a pharmacy school. It's not equal if you don't have a law school. But if they had pushed in the late 30s against separate as well as against equal, we might have had some school integration before the 1950s, when you could call anybody who wanted to send their kid to an integrated school a communist, and it might have gone down better. Let me see if I can think of one other moment in which we could have taken a different turn. Yes. You know, she asked, what about an anti-lynching law? We could have passed a federal anti-lynching law in any of the, it came up in almost every congressional session from 1914 onward. White Southern senators certainly filibustered against every anti-lynching law. Indeed, we do have some trouble with federal laws from criminal acts, but as soon as Lindbergh's child got kidnapped, we made kidnapping a federal crime. So had there been a moment that we could have passed a federal anti-lynching law, which it looked like we might have in the late 30s, that would have made a huge difference. States were, you know, part of what happened in the late 30s was they stopped lynching so much and then put people through sort of what they called mob trials. That's what happened with Scottsboro, quote, boys. That's what happened with this guy named Odell Waller. He had a fair trial, and he was sentenced to death, and Pauli Murray said he couldn't have had a fair trial in 3.5 hours with an all-white jury of landlords. So there's an evolution in state laws. We're getting fewer lynchings. Some of them are being prosecuted. But if we'd ever passed a federal anti-lynching law, if the federal government had ever once acted, it didn't do anything for 40 years to help black people in the South. It never intervened in the South. That's why, in retrospect, Little Rock was so totally astonishing to white Southerners. Okay. Yes, sir? Back.
You talked about the connection between what was going on in the South and what was going on in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Today, South is part of this globalization experience. I wondered if we could go back to the 20s and 30s and think about Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Cuba, the Caribbean. What connections there existed, either in terms of white supremacy or challenges to it that crossed the borders between the Southeast of the U.S. And the rich West Indies and places like Haiti. I'm thinking of the Garvey movement.
Well, we could think of Haiti, too. I don't talk so much about Garveyism, which is the United Negro Improvement Association. There were at least 250 Garvey chapters in the South. There's a great book to be written there. But everybody in my book has to want to overturn Southern white supremacy, and they have a different formula. So they're not a major aspect to the book. But a major aspect of the book is the extension of Southern white supremacy to Haiti, where we send not only troops who are 2/3 Southerners, but we take their classical universities, which had been teaching in French, close down 27 of them and open 11 vocational agricultural teachers' colleges, sending over a white Southerner named George Freeman to teach them how to farm. He cannot, however, speak French, and so he has to give his lectures with somebody translating for him. Finally, young Haitians are so mad. The kids in school are so mad. This guy named Jacques Romain, who had been educated actually in France and come back, starts a revolution against George Freeman personally. He says this guy, this occupier, is going to make us all stupid. They put people, and it's actually true. The American the American occupiers did three things. They ran the healthcare system, which actually may have been a good thing. They put Haitians in slavery on something called corvée labor. They took people and put them to work on the roads like the chain gangs. They used the chain gang model to do internal improvements. I don't know if this would work in Iraq, but we'll probably be trying it next. And they did this, they abolished higher education and started vocational training. Jacques Romain was arrested. He ultimately comes out of prison, joins the Communist Party. They made him a communist. Gets to know all of these people in the United States, and tries to lead a revolution against the occupying forces. The NAACP was the premier activist against the occupation of Haiti. It is a primary concern to them in the 20s and 30s. James Weldon Johnson, the executive secretary of the NAACP, is called the most esteemed man in Haiti. And he sees it as a blatant attempt by the white South to export white supremacy under Woodrow Wilson. The occupation is led by a guy named Josephus Daniels, who's Secretary of the Navy, who is the man who masterminded white supremacy in North Carolina, and the villain of my first book, Gender and Jim Crow. So there's lots of connections, and I thank you for asking that question too. Thank you so much. You're a great audience.